There is a kind of obedience that looks holy from the outside and still delays everything God wants to do in your life. It sings in church, it serves on time, it gives when asked, it nods during sermons, it knows how to sound surrendered, and yet heaven keeps pressing on the same place over and over, because God is not asking for more activity. He is asking for access. He is not waiting for you to become more impressive. He is waiting for you to unlock the one room you keep calling private, the one room you have decorated with Christian language, so no one notices it is still under your control. And that is why some believers pray hard and still feel stuck. It is not always because they are under attack. It is not always because they are in a wilderness. It is not always because the timing has not come. Sometimes it is because the altar is crowded with many offerings. But the one thing God actually asked for is still hidden behind a locked door. This is not the kind of message people usually celebrate, because most of us would rather hear that one more prayer, one more fast, one more seed, one more disciplined week, one more push of faith will open what has been delayed. But what if the delay is not waiting on more effort? What if it is waiting on surrender at the point you keep protecting most? What if the very place you call wisdom is actually resistance? What if the thing you keep managing is the thing God keeps touching because it has become the true ruler of your life? This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because we are trained to think disobedience is always loud. We imagine rebellion as obvious compromise, public sin, open defiance, reckless choices, visible collapse. But the most dangerous form of resistance is rarely loud. It is respectable, it is disciplined, it is sincere in many areas, it is even fruitful in some seasons. That is why it is so hard to expose. It does not look like turning from God. It looks like following Him almost everywhere, except the one place that would cost you too much. And that almost is powerful enough to deceive you for years. You can obey God in public and resist Him in private. You can surrender your schedule and still protect your future. You can give Him your habits and still withhold your wound. You can speak about trust while secretly reserving the final decision for yourself. You can be faithful in areas that gain approval while fiercely guarding the thing that gives you identity, comfort, control, or emotional survival. And because you are doing so much right, you begin to assume that what remains hidden must not matter that much. But the kingdom does not work like that. God does not measure surrender by the number of things you laid down. He measures it by whether the throne is actually empty enough for Him to rule. One protected room can influence the entire house. One unsurrendered attachment can distort every other act of obedience. One thing you insist on controlling can keep turning every prayer back toward the same lesson, because God is too loving to decorate a prison you built for yourself. He will not bless what keeps you divided. He will not strengthen what competes with Him for ownership. He will not give peace to the thing that is quietly replacing trust. And sometimes the reason heaven feels repetitive is not because God has nothing new to say. It is because you are still standing at the last thing He clearly said. There are people listening right now who have been asking God for a new word, and He keeps bringing them back to the same conversation. The same person, the same fear, the same bitterness, the same relationship, the same ambition, the same compromise that does not look dramatic enough to call sin, but strong enough to shape every major decision. The same hidden dependency, the same dream you have stopped calling an idol only because you have learned how to mention it in spiritual language. The same private vow you made when you were wounded, and now that vow has become more authoritative in your heart than the voice of God. You say you trust Him, but What you really trust is the wall you built after disappointment. You say you are waiting on his timing, but what you really mean is that you will obey once his instruction stops threatening the thing you cannot imagine living without. And the painful part is that many believers do not know they are doing this. They are not consciously rejecting God. They are protecting a place in themselves that feels too costly to expose. They are not saying no out loud. They are saying almost. They are saying later. They are saying once I understand. They are saying once I feel peace. They are saying once it hurts less. They are saying once I can see how this turns out. They are saying once I know I will still be okay if I lose this. But God hears something deeper beneath all those sentences. He hears the trembling human instinct to survive without full dependence. He hears the last reserve of self-rule. He hears the quiet claim to ownership. And because he loves you, he keeps returning to the same place until the issue is no longer hidden beneath your good behavior. This is why some of the most sincere believers are also some of the most tired. They are carrying the friction of divided obedience. They are trying to move forward while dragging a locked room behind them. They are asking God to bless the whole house while keeping one key clenched in their hand. And the soul was not built for that kind of split allegiance. It creates spiritual exhaustion. It creates repetition. It creates the feeling that you are close to breakthrough and still somehow unable to cross into it. Not because God enjoys prolonging pressure, but because he is after something deeper than momentum. He is after wholeness. He is after a life that is not operating in compartments. He is after sons and daughters who do not merely obey in the areas that feel manageable, but trust him in the place where control feels like oxygen. That is why the first 10,000 characters of this message must land with force. Because if you miss this, you will misread your whole season. Some of you have been calling it warfare when it is actually invitation. Some of you have been calling it delay when it is actually divine insistence. Some of you have been asking God to remove a burden that was sent to expose the room you refuse to open. Some of you are fighting the process that would free you, because freedom does not always begin with relief. It often begins with surrender at the exact point where your flesh feels most threatened. There's a moment in Scripture that should disturb every serious believer, because it reveals how terrifying respectable disobedience can become. King Saul was not asked to ignore God. He was asked to obey him fully. He went to battle. He did much of what he was told. He could point to visible action. He could tell a story of effort. He could stand before the prophet and say, I carried out the Lord's instruction. That is what makes the scene so dangerous. He was not standing there as an obvious rebel. He was standing there as a man convinced that partial obedience could still be called faithfulness. But Samuel did not speak to him as though the missing pieces were minor. He exposed the center of the matter. To obey is better than sacrifice. Why? Because sacrifice can be performed while the heart remains divided. Sacrifice can be offered to cover what obedience would have surrendered. Sacrifice can create the appearance of devotion while preserving self-rule underneath. Saul kept what looked valuable, and in doing so he revealed that he still reserved the right to edit God's command according to his own reasoning. That is the issue many believers still carry. They do not refuse God entirely. They revise him. They obey him selectively. They trim the command until it fits their emotional budget. They keep what seems useful to them and call the rest unnecessary extremity. They say things like, surely God understands. Surely he knows my heart. Surely this one part is not the real issue. But the reason God presses on the unsurrendered thing is not because he is obsessed with taking things away. It is because whatever you cannot release is already too powerful in your life. Whatever you cannot place on the altar is already shaping you more than you admit. Whatever you keep defending from God's touch is no longer just a preference. It is a rival, and rivals do not have to be evil to be spiritually deadly. Sometimes the rival is a dream. Sometimes it is your image. Sometimes it is being needed. Sometimes it is emotional control. Sometimes it is a person whose presence became your permission to feel safe. Sometimes it is the story you tell yourself about who you must become in order to matter. Sometimes it is a hidden grief you do not want healed, because without it you no longer know how to explain your distance. Sometimes it is success. Sometimes it is a relationship that is not overtly wicked, just deeply governing. Sometimes it is your pain itself, because pain can become strangely powerful when it becomes your identity. Sometimes what you refuse to surrender is not pleasure, but self-protection. That is why this message cannot stay shallow. We are not talking about obvious wickedness alone. We are talking about the sacred-looking structures people build to avoid total dependence. We are talking about the emotional systems that keep them functioning while quietly resisting transformation. We are talking about the respectable walls that let people remain committed and still unavailable to the deepest work of God. And the reason God keeps touching that final room is simple. He is not merely interested in your service. He wants your trust. Trust is always revealed by what you release when he asks. Anyone can offer what they have already outgrown. Anyone can surrender what no longer feels central. But when God places his hand on the thing that still stabilizes your sense of self, that is when obedience becomes truth. That is when the soul is exposed. That is when you discover whether God is truly Lord or simply honored guest. It is easy to say, Jesus is first when he has not yet touched second place. It is easy to talk about surrender and worship when surrender still feels poetic. But when he enters the room you built for survival, when he asks for what you used to keep yourself together, when he says, "Trust me here, and nowhere else will work until you do," then the language becomes costly. Then your theology stops being theory. Then obedience stops being about principles and becomes intensely personal. This is why some of you have been feeling a strange heaviness every time a certain subject arises. It is not random. It is not merely emotional sensitivity. It may be the Spirit of God refusing to let you make peace with the place where your life is still divided. He is too kind to let you drift into greater influence with a hidden throne still standing. He is too loving to answer every public prayer while your private trust remains negotiated. He is too committed to your freedom to let you build a successful Christian life around one room that still belongs to fear. And perhaps that is the line many people need to hear. You can build a very functional Christian life around one unsurrendered fear. You can still serve, still preach, still lead, still give, still cry and worship, still be sincere, and still organize your actual life around the one thing you are terrified to lose. But eventually God comes for that thing, not because he is cruel, but because if he leaves it untouched, it will keep interpreting everything else. It will decide how far you obey. It will define how quickly you respond. It will shape your relationships, your discernment, your peace, your pace, your boundaries, your generosity, your imagination, your courage, and your capacity for intimacy with God. It will become the invisible center, and invisible centers are dangerous precisely because they do not announce themselves. They hide under good behavior. They stay sheltered by routine. They benefit from the fact that everyone around you can see how much you are doing right. But God does not judge by visible compliance. He searches the heart. He sees the organizing love beneath all your decisions. He knows whether your life is actually arranged around him or merely decorated for him. Let that sink in. Some lives are arranged around Christ. Others are only decorated for him. Both may look similar in public for a while. Both may sing the same songs and use the same language and occupy the same pews. But one life moves from surrender, the other moves from self-preservation with Christian aesthetics. One life follows the Lamb wherever he goes. The other follows him until he approaches the final locked door. And when he does, everything feels tense. Prayer becomes heavier. Worship becomes more exposing than comforting. The same sermon keeps sounding personal. The same lesson keeps returning from different angles. You meet different people, enter different seasons, change churches, change jobs, change routines, and still the same underlying pressure remains. Why? Because geography does not solve what surrender has not touched. New atmospheres do not free what old fear still governs. More information does not liberate a room whose main lock is control. And this is where a lot of people become spiritually frustrated. They assume if the same issue keeps returning, God must be angry or disappointed or withholding. But the repetition is often mercy. Repetition means he has not left you alone with your substitute center. Repetition means he still intends to make you whole. Repetition means he is not distracted by your visible faithfulness in other places. He loves you too much to be impressed by the parts of your obedience that cost you less, while the main rival remains untouched. That may sound severe, but it is actually deeply hopeful. It means God is not fooled by spiritual activity, and he is not discouraged by your mixed condition. He knows exactly where freedom is waiting. He knows exactly what has kept you circling. He knows exactly why your soul still feels split in certain moments. And he is not asking for more noise. He is asking for the key. Now, here is where the message must go deeper, because many people think if God keeps pressing on a certain area, it must mean that area is especially shameful. Not necessarily. Often the room God asks for is not the dirtiest room. It is the most defended one. It may contain something beautiful but overvalued. It may contain something painful but overprotected. It may contain something legitimate that slowly became ultimate. Abraham's Isaac was not sin. That is what makes the story terrifying. God did not ask him to surrender a vice. He asked him to surrender a promise. He touched not the evil thing, but the beloved thing. He touched the place where gift and God could easily become confused. That is why the altar matters so much in Scripture. Altars reveal order. They reveal who is first. They reveal whether blessing has become more emotionally central than the one who gives it. Abraham had already obeyed in many directions before Isaac ever came into the picture. He left his land. He trusted through delay. He believed in old age. He built altars across his journey. But none of those moments carried the same blade edge as Moriah. Why? Because God does not measure maturity by the number of miles you have walked. He measures it by what happens when he touches what you love most. And notice what Abraham did not receive on the mountain. He did not receive a full explanation. He did not receive emotional cushioning. He did not receive a polite theological essay about why this painful request would eventually make sense. He received a call. He received a place. He received a demand that reached through promise and pressed directly against attachment. That is how God works when he is after the hidden center. He goes beneath your categories. He does not merely remove bad habits. He reorders loves. He does not merely improve behavior. He reveals what rules the heart. That is why the locked room is so dangerous. It convinces you the issue is practical when it is actually worship. You think the struggle is about timing, but it is about trust. You think the tension is about confusion, but it is about ownership. You think the exhaustion is about attack, but it is about the weight of maintaining partial control while trying to live under full surrender. And let me say something that may sting but will set some people free. Some of you are not confused, you are conflicted. Confusion says, I do not know what God is asking. Conflict says, I know what he is asking, but the asking threatens something I still need too much. Those are not the same, and the faster you stop misnaming conflict as confusion, the faster freedom can begin. Because God is gentle with confusion, but he confronts divided loyalty. He will comfort uncertainty, but he will not bless self-rule simply because it has learned how to speak softly. That is why one of the most spiritual things you can do is stop exaggerating your lack of clarity when the deeper issue is unwillingness. Honesty becomes the first crack in the door, Lord. I know what you are touching. I know why I keep circling. I know this is not really about needing more proof. I'm afraid. I'm attached. I do not know who I am without this. I do not know how to breathe if I release it. That prayer is closer to surrender than 100 polished declarations that never name the real rival. God can do much with trembling honesty. What he does not bless is a life that keeps performing devotion while silently reserving the right to self-govern in the decisive place. This is why Jesus was so unsettling to sincere people. He did not merely ask for moral improvement. He identified hidden rulers. To one man he touched wealth. To another he touched reputation. To another he touched self-righteousness. To Peter he touched control and confidence. To the rich young ruler, he did not say, your commandments mean nothing. He exposed the one thing they had not yet touched. You still lack one thing? That sentence should haunt any serious disciple, not because God enjoys reducing people to insufficiency, but because one thing can govern everything else. One unyielded attachment can interpret the whole spiritual life. The rich young ruler was not a hypocrite in the simple sense. He was earnest, disciplined, morally admirable. But when Jesus placed his finger on the hidden center, sorrow rose. Why sorrow? Because the soul can recognize when God has identified the true rival. Sorrow often appears where exposure and attachment meet. That is what some of you are feeling in this season. Not just conviction, sorrow, a heavy sadness, whenever God gets too close to the place you still call yours. That sadness is not proof that God is asking something unreasonable. It may be proof that he has named exactly what your heart has been leaning on all along. And if you ignore that moment, you can keep the structure of discipleship while missing its center. You can leave with sorrow and still keep your moral life intact, your community intact, your spiritual vocabulary intact, even your public reputation intact. What you lose is not always visible right away. What you lose is the deep movement of surrender. What you lose is the intimacy that comes when nothing remains defended from God. What you lose is the authority that grows only where self-rule has truly died. People wonder why certain believers carry unusual weight when they speak, pray, or simply enter a room. It is not always gifting. It is often that something in them has gone to the altar and stayed there. There is a difference between gifted presence and surrendered presence. Gifted presence impresses. Surrendered presence carries gravity. Gifted presence can draw attention. Surrendered presence shifts atmospheres. Gifted presence may know how to say the right thing. Surrendered presence has lost too much to need performance. That kind of authority cannot be faked because it is born where explanations end. It is born in the place where a person stops negotiating with God over the final room. That is why the enemy fights so hard to keep that room locked. He does not mind activity that leaves the hidden center intact. He does not mind sacrifice that never reaches the throne. He does not mind ministry built on an unsurrendered emotional system. He does not even mind certain forms of success if the core attachment remains untouched, because then all the fruit will still grow around a secret center of self-preservation. And whatever grows around a false center will eventually become exhausting to maintain. That is one reason some people burn out, doing things God really did call them to do. The issue is not always the calling. The issue is the center from which they are carrying it. Ministry from a defended heart drains differently than ministry from surrender. Marriage from a defended heart strains differently. Leadership from a defended heart controls differently. Service from a defended heart resents differently. Even generosity from a defended heart calculates differently. The hidden room leaks into everything. You may think you have contained it, but it keeps tinting the water. So what does God do? He begins to narrow the conversation. He may remove certain distractions. He may allow certain props to fail. He may let familiar comforts stop working. He may strip away the old emotional rewards that used to make obedience feel easier. He may let your usual coping systems lose power. Not because he is punishing you, but because he is bringing the real issue into the light. He is too merciful to let you keep calling survival surrender. He is too faithful to let you mistake constant activity for wholehearted trust. He is too invested in your future to permit the final room to remain untouched forever. Some people think the proof of spiritual maturity is that they no longer feel deeply disturbed by God. But mature surrender is not numbness, it is availability. It is not the absence of cost, it is the presence of yielded trust. The most mature people in Scripture were not the least disturbed by God's requests. They were the ones who stopped treating disturbance as a reason to disobey. Jesus in Gethsemane did not float above anguish, he entered it. He felt the weight so intensely that the garden itself became a place of holy pressure. Yet what emerged there was not emotional ease, it was surrender. Not my will, but yours. That sentence is not gentle in the way many posters make it seem. It is the death sentence of self-rule. It is the opening of the final room. It is the place where obedience stops asking life to remain intact on the old terms. And perhaps that is why some of you have been dreading this moment. You know if you open the room, something about your current identity may not survive. The version of you that needed to manage everything. The version of you that relied on being desired, needed, admired, safe, always prepared, always informed, always in control, always in control. Always capable of walking away before being hurt. The version of you that built a spiritual life around minimizing vulnerability. The version of you that called certain boundaries wisdom when they were actually old vows made in fear. The version of you that kept enough obedience to feel secure and enough distance to avoid total trust. Yes, something about that version of you must die, and that is why surrender feels so much like grief. You are not only releasing a thing, you are releasing the self that formed around that thing. You are letting go of the person you learned to be in order to survive without total dependence. No wonder the flesh fights so hard. No wonder people delay for years. No wonder they prefer sermons about destiny over sermons about ownership. Destiny sounds exciting. Ownership sounds invasive. Influence sounds inspiring. The altar sounds final, but the altar is where true authority begins. Not because God loves loss for its own sake, but because anything you gain without surrender would only deepen the false center. He will not let your life expand around the very thing he intends to crucify. That is mercy, hard mercy, but mercy. Now let us bring this even closer. What does the locked room usually look like in ordinary life? Sometimes it looks like a person you refuse to place fully in God's hands. You obey God almost everywhere else, but your mood, your peace, your discernment, and your pace are all still governed by whether that person stays close, approves of you, chooses you, or remains available to your need. You do not bow to them openly, but your life bends around them. Sometimes the room is ambition, you call it calling, and maybe part of it truly began there. But somewhere along the way, the desire to be fruitful became the need to be significant. Now obedience is subtly arranged around what protects your imagined future. You are willing to do the will of God as long as it does not threaten the version of greatness you have been privately rehearsing. Sometimes the room is pain. You have lived with disappointment so long that your wound became your lens. Now every command of God passes through old injury. Every delay confirms abandonment. Every hard instruction feels unsafe. Every relationship is approached with quiet suspicion. You do not even notice how much your grief still governs you. Because sorrow has been with you for so long, it feels like self-knowledge. Sometimes the room is image. You can appear humble while organizing everything around how you are seen. You can serve while still protecting the fantasy of being the wise one, the needed one, the pure one, the one who is above weakness. Then God touches failure, obscurity, humiliation, or hiddenness, and suddenly you discover how dependent you were on being perceived a certain way. Sometimes the room is money, not always greed in its obvious form, but control. You do not trust possessions because you are selfish. You trust them because they make unpredictability feel survivable. Sometimes the room is your right to understand. This one hides in intelligent believers often. They are sincere, thoughtful, discerning, careful, all beautiful things. But beneath them sits a final demand. God may lead, but he must explain. He may command, but he must make it make sense. He may redirect, but he must do so within the boundaries of what I can mentally reconcile. That is still self-rule, only with better grammar. Sometimes the room is comfort, not luxury in the worldly sense, but emotional predictability. You will obey God so long as obedience does not destabilize your routines, threaten your energy, unsettle your peace, or make you face conflict you would rather avoid. The room may even be ministry itself. Yes, ministry can become the room. You can give God your usefulness in order to avoid giving him your woundedness. You can hide from intimacy behind impact. You can stay constantly needed so you never have to sit in the quiet place where he touches what is unresolved. That is why some people fear rest more than work. Rest removes the camouflage. Suddenly the house is quiet enough to hear the knock on the locked door. That is where the question becomes unavoidable. What is the thing in your life that you still need in order to feel okay? Not enjoy, need. What is the thing whose loss feels like personal collapse? Not because it is evil, but because it has become foundational to your emotional survival. That is likely close to the room God keeps touching. And here is the mercy hidden in all this severity. God does not come for the room to shame you. He comes for it to set you free from the burden of needing anything more than him in order to remain internally steady. Because whatever you need more than God to be at peace will control you. It will own your reactions, your timing, your fear, your compromises. your relationships, your imagination, your future, your grief, and your pace. Freedom is not merely getting more blessings from God. Freedom is becoming less governable by what is not God. That is why the locked room must open, not for his ego, for your liberation. And this is why so much Christian frustration feels strange. People want freedom from anxiety while protecting the very attachment that manufactures it. They want peace without relinquishing control. They want clarity without surrender. They want breakthrough without altar. They want God to stabilize them, while the real center remains elsewhere. But God does not heal by reinforcing substitutes. He heals by removing rivals. He does not comfort false centers into holiness. He exposes them. He presses on them. He lets them shake. He makes them feel less reliable than before, because the shaking is revelation. It is him saying, "See how unstable this has always been. See how much weight you placed on what could never hold you. See why you are exhausted. See why this cycle keeps repeating. Come out of that room. Hand me the key. Let me become more than honored language in your life. Let me actually rule." This is where many people asked the wrong question. They ask, "What will God take if I surrender this?" But the better question is, what has this thing already taken by remaining unsurrendered? How much peace has it eaten? How many delays has it interpreted? How many prayers has it distorted? How many relationships has it complicated? How much joy has it postponed? How many decisions has it silently governed? How much mental space has it occupied? How much identity has it stolen? How often has it made you call fear wisdom and delay discernment and distance maturity? The room always costs more than you think. It promises safety, but it charges intimacy. It promises stability, but it charges freedom. It promises self-protection, but it charges authority. Because you cannot carry unusual spiritual weight while still living from a hidden rival. Heaven will love you, use you, grow you, and still keep bringing you back to the same doorway until the issue is resolved. So what happens when a believer finally opens the room? The answer is not always what people expect. Sometimes they think surrender should produce immediate emotional relief, instant clarity, a dramatic sense of lightness, and a perfectly visible new season by the next morning. Sometimes that happens in part, often it does not. Often the first thing surrender produces is exposure. The room feels smaller than you imagined, and more powerful than you admitted. You see how much of your life bent around it. You notice patterns you had excused for years. You realize how many choices were shaped by the thing you kept defending. That can be humbling. Sometimes it is painful, but humility is not cruelty. It is the beginning of clean vision. Then something else happens. The energy previously spent maintaining the room begins to release. You no longer need to defend, excuse, rename, protect, or constantly calculate around the hidden center. That does not mean every feeling disappears. It means you are no longer serving what you once managed. There is a new kind of interior honesty. You stop editing your prayers. You stop bargaining in worship. You stop pretending certain tensions are merely complicated when they are actually about trust. And from that honesty comes alignment. Alignment is not hype. It is quiet. It feels like the soul finally standing with both feet in the same place. It feels like prayer no longer having to move around a secret reservation. It feels like obedience no longer splitting into public devotion and private control. It feels like there is less noise between the voice of God and your response. That is why surrendered people often look calmer, not because they got everything they wanted, but because the war of divided ownership has ended. The room is no longer under dispute. Does that mean life becomes easy? No, sometimes surrender makes the next steps harder outwardly. Abraham still walked up the mountain. Jesus still went to the cross. Peter still had to step out of the boat. Mary still had to say yes to a calling that would cost her explanation, comfort, and reputation. Surrender does not eliminate cost. It changes the center from which cost is carried. A surrendered soul can carry heavier assignments with less internal fragmentation than an unsurrendered soul can carry a smaller one. That is one reason some people are overwhelmed by responsibilities. Others seem to hold with strange steadiness. The difference is not always strength. It is often center. One person is carrying from control. The other is carrying from yielded trust. One has to preserve self and obey at the same time. The other has already laid down self-rule. There is less inner drag. And from that place, something holy begins to form that many believers long for, but few understand: authority. Real authority is not loud certainty. It is not charisma. It is not the ability to gather attention. It is not even impressive knowledge. Real authority is what happens when a life no longer argues with God over ownership. It is the weight that comes from alignment. It is the steadiness that comes from having lost the need to protect a hidden center. It is the discernment that grows when fear no longer interprets every instruction. It is the gravity of someone who has nothing left to prove, because the decisive thing has already been surrendered. This kind of authority is not glamorous. It is often hidden for a long time. Crowds may prefer more polished voices, but heaven knows the difference. Hell knows the difference too. The spirit realm recognizes what has truly gone to the altar. That is why some prayers feel heavier than others. That is why some believers, when they speak, seem to carry more than information. They carry the consequence of surrendered ownership. God trusts them with certain burdens because there is less in them left to exploit for ego. He can whisper harder things because they are no longer demanding that every instruction protect their image or comfort. He can entrust them with obscurity because they are no longer living for visibility. He can let them wait because they are no longer using speed as proof of favor. He can let them lose because they are no longer measuring faithfulness only by outcomes. And when such people finally do receive open doors, those doors do not become idols as easily, because the center was already settled in hidden places. This is why the message matters so much. God is not trying to make you more religious. He is trying to make you undivided. An undivided life is powerful, not because it is perfect, but because it is no longer arranged around a substitute center. And maybe that is the word many of you have been waiting for. You do not need a more dramatic spiritual life first. You need an undivided one. You do not need more Christian activity to prove sincerity. You need the locked room opened. You do not need a fresh emotional wave every week to keep yourself going. You need the throne cleared. You do not need 5 more confirmations for what God already touched months ago. You need courage to stop calling conflict confusion. If this is landing on you now, do not rush past it. Let the Spirit be specific. Ask Him without performance, without hurry, without the old instinct to soften the answer. Lord, where is the room? What is the key I still keep closing my fist around? What thing, person, dream, wound, fear, control system, identity structure, or hidden demand still occupies more of my trust than I have admitted? Do not ask that lightly if you plan to protect your comfort. But ask it if you want freedom more than image. Ask it if you are tired of repeating the same season under different names. Ask it if you are ready for the cycle to stop. Ask it if you suspect that what feels like delay is really the kindness of God refusing to let you build the next chapter on a false center. Then when he answers, do not be surprised if the answer is simpler than you wanted and more costly than you preferred. God often speaks with terrifying clarity once we stop requiring dramatic language. He may point to forgiveness, not because the other person deserved it, but because your pain became a room you furnished so carefully that bitterness now sits at the table of every major decision. He may point to a relationship, not because love is bad, but because you have been using that person as proof that you are secure. And no human being can bear that weight without becoming an idol or a tyrant in your emotional world. He may point to a dream, not because he intends never to fulfill it, but because you can no longer tell the difference between trusting him and needing that future to happen in order to feel your life was worth something. He may point to hidden habits of self-protection that everybody around you calls maturity, because they look calm, but he knows they are fear wearing a composed face. He may point to secrecy, not the dramatic kind perhaps, but the kind that keeps you unexposed just enough to preserve control. He may point to performance, to ministry, to your need to be understood, to your obsession with outcomes, to the money you keep naming wisdom, to the grief you refuse to let him heal because you do not know who you would be without the ache. Whatever the room is, the process will usually follow a pattern. First comes recognition, then resistance, then bargaining, then sorrow, then, if grace is not resisted, surrender. Bargaining is where many stay, they say. Lord, I will give you more around the edges if you stop touching the center. I will pray more, serve more, be more disciplined, become more consistent, give more, learn more, help more, as long as you leave this one thing in my hands. That bargain has echoed through religious history. It sounds devout because it offers more sacrifice. But again, sacrifice cannot replace surrender. Saul teaches that. The rich young ruler teaches that. The Pharisees teach that. You can multiply religious activity and still remain untouched where it matters most. God is not uninterested in discipline. He is uninterested in substitutes. He wants truth in the inward parts. He wants the room. And if you refuse, he may allow you to keep building for a while. That is another mercy many misread. Sometimes God does not collapse the whole structure immediately. Sometimes he lets you feel the increasing exhaustion of carrying success around a hidden center. He lets you see that even fruit can become tiring when it grows from divided ground. He lets you notice how peace disappears the moment the protected thing is threatened. He lets you experience how thin your joy becomes when the unsurrendered room is shaken. He lets you see that you are still too governable by what is not him, not to humiliate you, to make the diagnosis undeniable. When the diagnosis becomes undeniable, the invitation becomes sharper. Open it. Stop narrating your life around the room. Stop organizing your future around the room. Stop editing your prayers to protect the room. Stop calling your slavery by beautiful names. Open it. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the room stays closed because people secretly believe that if they surrender it, God will mishandle them. They may never say that sentence, but their nervous system believes it. They have theology for trust, but not history for it. Somewhere in their story, loss taught them that openness is dangerous, dependence is risky, and unguarded hope gets punished. So when God comes near the room, they do not feel invited. They feel threatened. It matters because healing is not only about renouncing idols. It is also about confronting the false image of God, hiding beneath them. If you truly believe God's will is mostly a threat to what is precious, you will always negotiate with him. If you truly believe that surrender means the destruction of your deepest good, you will keep some keys. That is why intimacy matters so much. The final room does not open by willpower alone. It opens as the heart becomes convinced that God is trustworthy enough to own what it once guarded. That does not mean you wait until fear disappears. It means you move while fear is still talking, because you have seen enough of his character to stop treating fear as your highest counselor. Abraham did not climb the mountain because the request made emotional sense. He climbed because the God who asked had already proven himself more trustworthy than the future Abraham was trying to protect. Jesus went to the cross not because the cup felt harmless, but because the Father was worthy, even in the dark. That is the kind of surrender God is forming, not reckless, not anti-thought, not detached from pain, but rooted in a deeper confidence than circumstance can generate. Some of you keep asking for more signs, but what you really need is a truer vision of God's character, because the room does not finally open when you get the plan. It opens when you decide he is safer than control. Let me put this plainly. Control feels safer because it is familiar, not because it is faithful. Self-protection feels wise because it lets you predict some forms of pain, not because it can lead you into life. The locked room may have preserved parts of you for a season, but it cannot father your future. Only God can do that, and he cannot father what you will not let him touch. That sentence may be the hinge for somebody tonight. He cannot father what you will not let him touch. He can preserve you. He can preserve you. He can remain present. But the deep formation, the authority, the undivided peace, the mature fruit, the next chapter built on true center rather than old fear, all of that requires access. Not because his power is limited, but because love does not force what surrender must willingly yield. So what does willing surrender look like practically? It often looks smaller and less dramatic than people expect. It may be one conversation you stop avoiding. It may be one confession you stop delaying. It may be one relationship you finally place completely in God's hands without trying to engineer the outcome from the shadows. It may be one dream you stop using as emotional life support. It may be one act of forgiveness that feels impossible because bitterness has become your last claim to justice. It may be one financial surrender that terrifies you because control has been your real source of calm. It may be one private vow you finally renounce aloud. I will never need anyone. I will never be weak again. I will always stay in control. I will make sure I am chosen. I will never let disappointment catch me unprepared. Those vows often become the architecture of the locked room. They do not always sound sinful, they sound protective. But what protects you from dependence also protects you from intimacy. And God will come for that architecture because he wants sons and daughters, not merely efficient survivors. When surrender begins, it often feels like weakness. That is because the flesh experiences the loss of control as danger. But on the other side of yielded weakness, there is a steadiness control could never produce. You become less reactive, less frantic for outcomes, less dependent on being understood, less afraid of hiddenness, less shaken by delay, less enslaved to what people do or do not do. Why? Because your center has moved. You are no longer deriving your peace from the room. You are learning to derive it from God. That shift changes everything. It does not make you passive. It makes you free to obey without constant calculation. It does not make you emotionless. It makes your emotions less tyrannical. It does not remove sorrow. It removes the hidden agreements that gave sorrow the right to govern. This is why surrendered people often feel both softer and stronger. Softer because they are no longer armoring every vulnerable place. Stronger because they are no longer carrying the exhausting burden of protecting a false center. And that kind of person becomes deeply useful to God. Not flashy useful, true useful. They can be trusted with people because they are not using people to stabilize themselves. They can be trusted with waiting because they are not using speed as evidence of worth. They can be trusted with visibility because obscurity no longer feels like death. They can be trusted with correction because image is no longer the hidden God. They can be trusted with silence because they have stopped interpreting every quiet season as abandonment. They can be trusted with hard assignments because the room that once ruled their reactions has already been opened. That is what heaven has been after all along, not more polished obedience, an open house, a cleared throne, an undivided heart, and perhaps that is why this message had to come to you this way. Not as a gentle suggestion, but as a searching light. Because some of you are close to a shift you cannot manufacture. Not a shift of hype, a shift of center. You have done enough circling, enough explaining, enough telling yourself that the issue is complicated when heaven keeps reducing it to trust. Enough offering God the parts that feel manageable while calling the central issue mysterious. It is not mysterious anymore. He has been kind enough to keep naming it. The real question now is whether you will open the door while the invitation is still tender, or whether you will wait until life itself has to shake harder to prove the room was never your refuge. Do not wait for harder mercy if softer mercy is speaking now. Do not wait for collapse to reveal what conviction is already making visible. Do not wait until the hidden center drains another year, another relationship, another season, another layer of your joy. Open the room, tell the truth, hand over the key, let God touch the thing you have called untouchable. Not because he delights in stripping you bare, but because he knows what waits on the other side of undivided trust. Peace with weight in it. Prayer without hidden bargaining, obedience without constant self-interpretation, joy that is not held hostage by outcomes, authority born from alignment, freedom from the exhausting need to keep one corner of your life perpetually defended. And if you are wondering what to do right now, do not start with a performance. Start with honesty, Lord. I know there is a room. I know you have been touching it. I know I have called conflict confusion and control wisdom and fear discernment. I know I have revised obedience at the point where it cost me most. I know I have tried to offer more around the edges while protecting the center. And I am tired of circling, tired of negotiating, tired of carrying a spiritual life arranged around one unsurrendered thing. I do not know how to release it perfectly, but I am willing to stop hiding it. That prayer can begin more than 1,000 loud declarations ever could, because God is drawn to truth, not polished truth, real truth, and once truth enters the room, grace is already near. He does not ask for the room because he plans to leave it empty. He asks for it because he intends to inhabit it. That is the final comfort and the final confrontation of this entire message. God never asks you to vacate a false center without offering his presence as the true one. He never removes a rival without offering himself as home. He never breaks an idol without revealing that the idol was exhausting you. He never calls you out of a defended space without inviting you into deeper rest. But rest does not come before surrender. It follows the opening of the door. So if you know this word was for you, stop calling the knock interruption. It may be the kindest thing God has done for you in a long time. Because the room you keep protecting is also the room keeping you tired. The key you keep clenching is also the key keeping you split. The thing you call survival may be the last chain, and the obedience God is waiting for is not louder worship, bigger language, or more visible sacrifice. It is the quiet, costly, irreversible yes that opens the final room and says, Lord, even here, especially here, you can have this too. When that happens, the season changes in ways no shortcut could have produced. Maybe not overnight in circumstances, but immediately in center. And once the center changes, everything else finally has somewhere true to grow. If this message found the exact place you have been hiding, do not scroll away from it unchanged. Sit with it, pray through it, move on it, and if you need a sentence to mark the moment, let it be this: I will not give God decorated obedience while keeping a locked room for myself. I will open the door. I will hand over the key. I will stop revising surrender. I will let the Lord of the house become Lord of the whole house. That is where peace begins. That is where authority grows. That is where the circling ends. That is where the next season stops being theory and becomes a life that is finally, quietly, wholly His.